For those of you who do not know, Filament Games creates playful experiences that improve people's lives, which is a nice way of saying that we make learning games. We've been doing that for about 13 years. It's super cool to see all of you here at 5 o'clock on a Saturday. If I'd known anybody would attend, I would have created a presentation. I'm kidding. I have a great presentation. No, it's actually quite dull because we're talking about money, but it's important, right? We have to talk about money. This presentation is ostensibly about how to fund VR projects, but I intentionally did that in 8-point font because I don't want you to think that this is like a comprehensive guide or anything like that. Because what in fact this is me relating to you 4 different experiences that we have had as a studio in attempting to, and in some cases successfully, funding projects to create virtual reality learning games. That's the other big caveat that I should throw out right at the beginning here, is that Filament, as I mentioned, is a learning game studio. So if you're looking to develop develop VR games and fund VR games for things that have nothing to do with learning, the rules may be entirely different. So that said, let's continue. This is an important dichotomy to point out right at the beginning. What I mean when I talk about flexible IP versus rigid IP is that on the left-hand column are all games that we worked collaboratively with the funding partner in order to develop the IP that was ultimately created. And on the right-hand side, the rigid IP is basically the IP that we generated in-house, the brainchild of Filament, and is an IP that we attempted to take to market of our own volition. Okay, so here's case study number 1. By the way, sneak preview, half of these are funded and half of them are not. So we're going to talk about some things that worked, some things that didn't work. So this first project was kind of a unique one in that it was a physical installation about endangered species. And the strategy for this particular project was venture capital. This is probably a mildly offensive image to any venture capitalists in the room, so I hope there are none. But I want to actually before I go on, is there anybody in the room from Microsoft, Sony, HTC, Oculus, Intel? Okay, just want to see how candid I can be. Cool. So this particular project, the attempt was to fund it through VC. The reason that made sense for this particular project was that it was going to be a physical installation, so there's large upfront and longitudinal costs associated with it. The only thing I'll say about this was that it did not end well. And there was a whole nother presentation about an hour ago about getting money from VCs for XR projects, so I won't say anything in depth about why it didn't go well, except to say that our understanding was that it was too early at that time. Now, granted, this was about 1.5 years ago. A lot of things have probably changed since then. But at that time, the VCs that were being pitched weren't quite ready for VR at that time. Again, that may have changed. Okay, moving on. So this project was a Google Cardboard accoutrement to a physical set of books. This is what the product ended up looking like. It was sold at Costco. So it's books about animals and dinosaurs and other things that kids can't fucking get enough of. And basically, this had a really kind of fairy tale ending. And the moral of this particular story, so I should back up and say the strategy here was to work with a consumer-facing publisher that had a path to market for the consumer market and an appetite for innovation, right? Those are the 2 very important ingredients here. And the reason, from my perspective, in hindsight, anecdotally, that this worked is that the publisher needed an evolution to their product, not a revolution. And so I think it was critical that it was Google Cardboard in this case, and I think it was critical that it was an accoutrement as opposed to a replacement for what their core competency was, which was making these really lovely books with things you've probably heard of like images and text. Okay, moving right along. This project is a game called Breaking Boundaries in Science. It's about the work of Jane Goodall, Marie Curie, and Grace Hopper, so famous female scientists, for those of you who live under a rock. Basically, the way that, starting again with the strategy here was to work with a VR hardware developer and to try to find a hole in their content portfolio. So in this particular case, Oculus was looking to fill a hole in their education content portfolio, and we worked collaboratively with them to come up with a pitch for a game that would fill that hole in a way that was acceptable to them and acceptable to us. This was funded. This game will be released on the first World Chimpanzee Day, which is July 24th, I think? 14th, thank you. World Chimpanzee Day. Yep, it's a thing. Yep, it is now. So while that is the strategy, I would say the moral here is that working with the hardware companies that make the VR, so namely Oculus and HTC, is a very timing-dependent bet, right? Because these organizations and whether or not they're funding content, funding new content, all depends on where they're at their strategy, and they're constantly trying to find the market, constantly pivoting. And so it's a very, I'll call it volatile thing to try to get into. The other maybe walk away from this one is that this was a Samsung Gear VR project, and I think our chances of success were higher from the beginning because Samsung Gear VR, particularly at that time, compared to all the other VR hardware out there, was doing quite well in terms of adoption. For anybody who's here specifically to learn about making high-end VR games, this is kind of the latest and greatest, at least that I've seen. There may be newer data than this about who's kind of leading the charge. Sony with PlayStation VR is really no surprise at all with their sort of built-in install base there. But I know HTC had kind of an early lead out of the gate, and then Oculus did these really aggressive price cuts, and now they officially are in the #2 spot. Okay, here's the last project. This is a game called Robo Engineers, and this is a longer, more drawn-out story because, as I mentioned, this is the rigid IP, and so we tried a lot more different strategies for this particular game. And the best way that I can describe those strategies is to say that they were eclectic, much like my favorite Bollywood movie, Ashoka, which starts as a very fun, playful action movie, and in the end, you're crying harder than like Eternal Sunshine for the Spotless Mind. Like, it's a real emotional roller coaster. And so, too, has been the story of trying to fund this game, Robo Engineers. So, so I'm going to talk about a bunch of different strategies here, and just know from the outset, this is still very much in process, and these conversations are ongoing and evolving literally within the last couple days. So the first strategy that we took for trying to find funding for this game was to talk to organizations peripheral to the VR space who have a vested interest in the success and proliferation of VR. So companies like Intel, HP, other OEMs, hardware, computer manufacturers. And in particular, so everybody is on the same team, right? Because if they sell a bunch of VR, we sell a bunch of content, HTC or Oculus or whoever sells a bunch of headsets, and these guys sell a bunch of computers and chips and et cetera, right? So everybody's kind of working toward the same goal. What we did beyond that is we worked with the people within those particular organizations who are trying to attack a new market. So basically, like, you know, what about VR in schools? How do we make that happen? How do we make VR in schools happen? No big deal. And so there's a bunch of really smart people trying to figure out how to make that work and seeing where they can make strategic investments, in many cases non-recoverable investments, which is just to say that they don't expect a return on that investment from your particular game, but rather from the market at large. So in Intel's case, for example, they were willing to do potentially, we were having conversations about an NRI. In HP's case, there was a conversation about whether or not they would pre-license the content, and that's basically as good as funding because it's like pre-sales. The moral of working this particular strategy is that as one part of the solution, which is to say as one game or one piece of content, you're obviously not the solution that they need in order to build a brand new vertical for VR in a market like education. And so it just requires a lot of patience. Okay, and then as I mentioned before, there's also, quick time check. There's also the companies that are making the VR hardware itself, right? And each of these, and we touched on this a little bit before when we talked about the volatility, but each of these organizations is working very hard to find the market, and large organizations that are working to find a market. The best way I can describe it is like praying to a very fickle God, right? So Windows Mixed Reality, for example, in our first conversations with them, didn't have a lot of money to offer. They're now reorging. Maybe there will be a lot of money after the reorg. PlayStation VR is currently undergoing a reorg. That also may be their way of telling us that they just don't like our game. So it's just hard to tell. Vive is not so much reorging right now, but we've had difficulty over time with them trying to anticipate and get out in front of their green light process. And from everything that I understand, they are now just funding for return on investment. So not the type of play that I mentioned before with Breaking Boundaries in Science, where they just want to add content to try to boost the overall ecosystem, but rather they really do want to see the money back that they invest in your game in the same way that a venture capitalist would. Okay. For those of you who are working in the education space, you can consider the small and large EDU publishers. So Pearson right now is the only of the big three being HMH, McGraw-Hill, and Pearson that I know of that has a very active VR initiative and is putting money into it. The lesson learned for us here was that and this probably comes as no surprise, but they're trying to build a large library of smaller experiences. And so they may be willing to license your content if you have a relatively small experience that fits the right platform for them. And then there are the medium and small publishers in the EDU space. Here's a couple of examples. So you get digital publishers like Sunburst Digital out of Chicago. You get Gravity Gaming, which create basically turnkey VR solutions for schools and libraries, where they'll like do the whole product solution with the VR cart and the hardware and everything all set up to go. And then you've also got like organizations that specifically sell VR products to libraries. And the walk away from having conversations with these types of organizations is that they probably won't fund your software development, but they will potentially fund the ecosystem of things that need to live around your product. So that could be curriculum, it could be providing money for the sales and marketing to get into the school. It could be dashboards for teachers, things of that nature.
But these are particularly small.
Yes, indeed. This one maybe, if I could impart one lesson of value, I hope it's this, because this took us quite a bit of time and money to learn. So we went to Game Connection at the Game Developers Conference in the spring. And I can say, at least at that point, and again, this was back in the spring, VR was the quickest way to kill a conversation with a funder. For those of you who do not know, Game Connection is basically a pitch event where you just pitch to consumer-facing game development publishers. So we took Robo Engineers and pitched in. We ended up, by the end of that event, we were definitely like, okay, we need a PC version of this product, and we're now also building a PC version of the product to carry on those conversations. Anyway, after that, this quote really resonated with me. It was like this really sort of like dark time for making a VR game. Back home, the team was super jazzed about VR, and out doing biz dev were like, show me the money, apropos to my first slide. So in thinking about this and how things have been progressing, I've been trying to figure out what the trends have been. I like this slide from u.gov for two reasons. One is it kind of explains why people have been scared off of funding VR in 2017 is because you see that super creepy plateau right there, right? That makes it look like we're all in a bad place. But the thing is, it also shows this macro level trend of like, I mean, look, cell phones. By the way, cell phones obviously didn't start at the same time as VR, but you know how to read data. So in the scheme of things, it's actually in a pretty healthy place. I think the problem was we all had really perhaps inflated expectations for what VR would do out of the gate, and we're all just maybe a little bit impatient about it. The other thing I think that made it really hard in 2017 is that not only are these numbers in 2016 and 2017 too small and they scare funders, but the other thing is that 75% of those bars is the hardware, and 75% of that money going to Oculus, HTC, Samsung, and the other people who make the actual hardware, which if you're asking somebody to fund software, it makes it a very, very difficult proposition. Now, of course, you see that really nice optimistic spike in 2018. Let's all knock on wood and hope that happens. That would certainly make things a lot easier. Another strategy is agents. And this one's very quick and easy. So, I mean, agents will basically represent you to game development publishers who can potentially fund your VR project. But if the game development publishers are not interested in funding VR, then the agents will not be interested in working with you. That's relatively straightforward. Just wanted to include it to be comprehensive. And we have not done a Kickstarter or any other crowdfunding campaign, but I wanted to throw it up here because I have to. And you probably all know this at this point, so pardon this is redundant, but I mean, basically the big reason basically that we have steered clear of doing this as a strategy so far is that we see these types of campaigns as a better way to gauge interest than to actually fund the product. And a lot of the times, by the time you put in money into your own Kickstarter to get the momentum going, by the time you pay out the rewards, by the time you spend money on managing your community, by the time you spend money on and time on marketing your Kickstarter, it's kind of a break-even event. Okay, and then this is probably like if you held a gun to my head and said, what's the one thing that I should do that actually has proven results? This is really it. So Filament, Shell, Killer Snails, I'm missing one, Electric Fun Stuff have all been funded by one of these two government institutions specifically to create a VR project at some point or another. Obviously, the government's really excited about it. This is the reason these SBIR programs exist. They fund risky, sort of newly developing technologies where there's no obvious market yet. But it is a pain in the ass. And it will take over a big chunk of your life. And also your chances of getting the grant are typically, statistically, about 15%. So in conclusion, this is this is where it a little bit feels like where we are right now. This story is definitely not over. I'm hopeful there will be a third episode, and but it's definitely it's been hard. You know, this point that we're at right now, the way I would characterize it is we are down, but we are not out. I think particularly if we see this kind of spike happen in 2018, the funding situation is going to change dramatically. And in fact, you still see very bullish reports like this, and VCs are seeing this same data. I can say, you know, Filament, long before VR, has been making learning games and looking at reports for the learning game market, and they just love these. It's just like, I feel like I could be a person who makes these charts. You just recycle this same chart for every market. It's gonna go up like crazy. But anyway, I mean, I know that in all seriousness, they actually do a bunch of diligence, they do a bunch of research, and it's not just totally made up. But it does, you can't see it, but the first 2 years for context there are 2016 and 2017. So if things like this are to be believed, I think we're right on the cusp of episode 3, and it's all going to be awesome. Thanks.